Hi, it's really nice to see you. How are you?
Good to see you as well. I'm well, I guess, given the times we're in.
Yeah.
It's hard to say I'm doing well when so many people are going through tough times right now.
I want to talk to you about where you just came back from Darian Gap, but to set that up, you talk about the tough times and how everybody's witnessing this and witnessing it in their own way, trying to process all of this. You have been to a lot of places around the world. You have shared a lot of tragedy with us and experienced some yourself. I'm just curious, as you go through this now and you listen to the Discord, where do you think we are in terms of having an understanding of what's happening in the world?
I mean, I think we're pretty polarized right now, which is really sad because I think what people like me try to do is connect people and actually, get to the point where we can document what's happening, provide some sort of context and understanding for what's going on so that at least people feel like they have an entry point or they can do something with the heartache that they feel and sort of all of the trauma we're witnessing collectively. I think that's difficult right now, particularly because there are several wars going on simultaneously that many of us are paying attention to. A lot of wars that happen, no one ever really pays attention to them, or they never get the attention in the media that they should get. But now we have Israel, Gaza, Israel, Hamas. We have Ukraine, Russia. We have the polarization that's happening in America, which is also really, really depressing.
Journalism was journalism. You know that for lots of reasons. Many people don't trust journalism, some legit, some not. We're in a place now where even access to information is heavy problematic. How do you cut through all that? How do we do that?
I mean, that's a very tough question. I think one of the issues, the main issue I have right now as a journalist, a photographer who's covered war for 25 years, is that we don't have access to these conflicts. When you look at what's happening in Israel and Gaza, for example, no international journalists are allowed into Gaza.
Yeah.
And that, to me, is fundamentally problematic because I think, we are a democratic society. A freedom of press is fundamental to us understanding what's going on in the world, to ensuring that, war crimes aren't happening, that recording human rights abuses, whatever is happening. And once you start censoring the media, that makes me very suspicious. And it also means that we're getting our news from people who aren't necessarily trained objective journalists. And so that's also really problematic. It means we're relying on sources that have not necessarily been vetted. And I think, we live in a world with AI where news can be altered, where there are various news sources that also bring in their opinion. And so it's really important to understand who you get your news from. Is it honest news? Is it, has it been vetted? Have the images been doctored or no? I think those are all questions we need to ask ourselves with the technology we have in this day and age.
And there's got to be an emotional toll that will hit you. And for people watching this and they think about the work you do, you have to see the beauty of humanity and the absolute horrors of humanity for a living.
Yeah, and it's been many, many years. I mean, I can't even count how many people I've seen die in front of me. I have seen mass graves. I have seen, I've seen soldiers. I've seen civilians with PTSD. I've seen women who have been sexually assaulted. I've kind of seen it all. And I think, what do I do with that sort of trauma and that toll? I channel it into my work. I think it's important, for me, I do this work because I believe people need to understand what happens around the world. They have to have perspective. We need to see the fruits of our foreign policy. And there has to be a historical record of our time, of everything happening. There has to be a document which accounts for what happens in this time in history. And so I find it a real privilege to be able to go to these places, but it is not without a toll. I mean, I get very emotional, especially when I sort of stop shooting and I pause for a moment and I look at those photos, that's when it really hits me. In the field I'm working, so I'm looking through my camera, I'm very focused on what I have to do. And so in those moments, it's not, I'm very much focused on the work.
Your ability to compartmentalize must be something really elite in the field.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. I mean, the brain is incredible. I think that, I try to be present wherever I am. And before we started this interview, I was saying I have two small children. And so I have to, when I come back from a war zone, it's not like I can sit around and mull over everything I've seen. I mean, I have to be a mother, I have to go. Sometimes I go from the airport coming out of 6-7 weeks in Ukraine, and I have to go read to my 5-year-old son's class, so it's two very different worlds that I live in.
Some of the most powerful images we've seen out of Ukraine are from you. And I wondered how when you're, especially in Ukraine, you saw some families, right at the end, you watch people die. Like you said, you've seen mass graves. I wonder how that affected you on a human level.
Yeah, I think that before I became a mother and I was covering these atrocities and really difficult things, it was hard for me to understand, not that it didn't pain me when I saw children suffering in war or families going through really difficult times, but it's a whole different thing because now that I'm a mother, because immediately I project myself and my children onto the people I'm photographing, and it becomes extraordinarily difficult. And I find myself much more emotional. I mean, everyone ironically says, you become more jaded as you get older and you become more stoic. And for me, it's the opposite. I mean, I'm like totally emotional all the time. And I allow that. I mean, I think, at the end of the day, I'm a human being. And I think the people I cover appreciate it. I think it's good for them to see that I'm not there because it's a job. I'm not going to Ukraine or Afghanistan or Iraq or any of these places because I'm getting paid for, to cover war. I'm doing it because I believe fundamentally in the importance of it.
Yeah, and these are people who have been exploited for gain for so long, right? That their distrust is so understandable. I'm curious about the climate crisis stuff that you're covering, but you just came back from the Darian Gap. Can you tell people what's happening there right now?
So the Darian Gap is a migrant trail that now in 2023, over 500,000 migrants have made their way through this perilous stretch of really dense and treacherous jungle, which is 70 miles long. So there are no roads, if something happens to you on this trail, there are poisonous snakes. People have heart attacks. Anything that happens, if you break your ankle, you're at risk of dying because there's no way out unless someone carries you. I mean, I'm 50 now, and I was sort of like, okay, am I crazy? Like, I'm going to have to scale boulders, and I literally, it's incredible. It's 12 hours a day. It's pouring rain half the time. I'm walking through rivers up to my waist half the time, on all fours, climbing up wet roots, literally mountains this angle. And if you slip, you fall off a cliff. I mean, it's not, you cannot take one wrong step. And on this route, there are dead bodies just on the way, because if you die, if something happens, no one can take you out. Right. And so it's really an extraordinary, I mean, it's so sad because, I go to document it, but there are people carrying newborns with them over this journey, and so it takes anywhere from 3 to 5 days depending on how much money you have.
I just wonder how are you feeling when you're taking these photos and you're witnessing this?
I mean, the Darian Gap was it was so overwhelming on kind of every level, physically, emotionally. You're uncomfortable in every sense of the word, and so it's so hard because, again, I'm thinking of how lucky I am that I'm not in a position where I feel like I need to drag my two children, risk their lives, my life, through this jungle to get to a place where I feel like I can give them an opportunity to live, So it's of course that sort of heartbreak, and it feels so horrible to be in that situation. But also I'm feeling like it's very difficult to take pictures in those moments, because I'm literally, every step is difficult. And so half the time I'm sort of so focused on work, I'm not even shooting, which is also really stressful, because I think obviously the reason to take this journey is to be able to document it, but it's very hard. It's hard all around.
What do you want people to see when they look at these photos? What do you want them to understand from this?
I mean, look, there's a massive immigration crisis in America right now. And I think we see the unbelievable images at the border. I mean, my colleague, John Moore, who's with Getty, has been shooting incredible work at the border. I think we know what's happening at the border, but I think for me, it's important to humanize, who are these people? Yeah, what do they go through before they get to the actual border? I mean, by the time they make it to the U.S. border with Mexico, they have been through hell and back. Most of them have been robbed, not once, but 10 times. Many of the women have been sexually assaulted. Many of them have lost loved ones on the way. And so I think it's important for me to put a human face on the immigration crisis.
Do you think there's empathy, compassion, a crisis of it, an absence of it, the fetishization of disasters? It's such a complicated world to navigate now, because we know that our brains can pretty easily we're highly suggestible, and we know that social media and advertisers and smart, nefarious people know how to use the algorithm to wreck us.
Absolutely.
Your job has changed dramatically in the last 25 years because of that, in a way, I'd imagine, just how the impact of these photos can have, or how they can be.
I mean, there's sort of several elements to that question. I think that overall we're lacking in empathy as a culture right now, like as a society. I think collectively we are, whether that's because we are so jaded by the sheer amount of images we see every single day, and the amount of graphic images and images of war and combat and civilians dying. And, I think it's so overwhelming that it's created this sort of either apathy or the effect of people just shutting down. Mm-hmm. And I think that is problematic. I think it's, look, we're human beings, of course, there's only so much we can take, but I think that it's created a society that's not only polarized, but very isolated. We're all kind of, when I first started out, I felt a lot more innocent. I felt like I would go to a place, journalists were respected, if not sort of revered. People appreciated the work we did. We were not targeted intentionally by governments who didn't want our coverage. I think now we're at a point where journalists are killed with impunity by autocratic leaders and governments who don't want journalists covering what's happening. I think people don't trust what we do. I mean, I think the fact is, for someone like me, I kill myself to get these stories. Mm-hmm. I physically and emotionally just kill myself to get these stories. And if I were creating fake news, like, why wouldn't I just sit in my home and create it? Why would I go through what I go through to get these stories if I could just make it up? I mean, that's what I don't understand.
If someone doesn't know, you've been kidnapped more than once.
Twice. I've been thrown out of a car on a highway in Pakistan. My driver died. I've been in ambushes by the Taliban, by Iraqi insurgents. I've been, the amount of friends who have died in the last 20 years. We just passed the anniversary of Chris Hondros and Tim Hetherington's death on the 20th. They were both very good friends. I think there is a toll. So anyone who just sort of says fake news and journalists or frauds or whatever, I think twice about it. Really think about what you're saying, because there are people who don't take this job seriously and who perhaps don't have the integrity that they should. Right. But the majority of journalists working for good publications do.
What's your relationship with fear like these days?
I mean, I would say I was I've never been fearless. I mean, I've always had a huge amount of fear when I work in dangerous places. But I think I've learned more how to navigate it, sort of how to recognize what is causing that fear, and to try and identify if I'm scared because of the PTSD that I have, because of the years of trauma and what's happened to me in the past, or if I'm scared because there's a real fear that there's like a Russian mortar position right over there and I'm in the line of fire. You know, I have to sort of go through a series of very quick questions that I have to ask myself and then figure out, okay, how do I manage this? Like, what do I do to either A, get out of this situation, or B, get to a position where I can still do my job but feel a little safer? I think when I was younger, I was much more fearless.
What's crazy is that, generally speaking, when you're running through all those questions, the answer is yes to all of them, almost all the time, right? It's all of them.
Yeah, I mean, I recognize that I'm not like a normal person, you know, like I'm not like, I think most women have very different fears than I do. I think for me, I like when I was younger and I used to go into war zones, I really felt I was invincible. You know, I felt like nothing will happen to me. I'm here because I believe in this work. I have like all good intentions and no one's going to try and kill me. And now I go into every single assignment like there's definitely someone trying to kill me on this assignment, because journalists have become targets in ways that they never were before.
Well, and not always from autocratic governments, now from democratic governments, now from governments with this sense of there's...
Which is so terrifying. I know.
You know, I think about, look, I know how politicized for lots of reasons the Palestine, the Gaza, Israel thing is, but the pictures can't lie, you know, in this case. And we see what's happening to journalists, we see what's happening to aid workers. We already know that lots of people don't trust the United Nations for good and, you know, for legitimate and illegitimate reasons. But I work with the World Food Program, and I've been with them for 13 years. I've been lucky enough, privileged enough to be in places like Pakistan and Haiti and in Sudan, Darfur during the genocide. And you see the work that's getting done. And so you have this cynicism, which used to just be personalized cynicism. And that's fine, you can have it. But now it's become the thing that moves governments and moves populism and moves all this. And now lives are being lost because of this. You've seen this all the time.
I mean, I think I agree with you. It's very hard to talk about some of the conflicts now without feeling like politicized. But I mean, I think if we look at the facts, you know, the fact is, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists and almost 100 journalists have been killed in Gaza alone, or Gaza, Lebanon, Israel, and a majority of them in Gaza. And I think that is unacceptable. It doesn't matter. No matter where you stand on that conflict, you know, that amount of journalists should not be dying to cover a conflict. And, you know, it's more than any other conflict in history. And that is really unbelievable.
You know, one of the challenges that we have is, and I think it's something that's really important for us to remind ourselves of, and the audience, and not just us who report on these things and you photograph them in that, but also the people who are watching this and watching and reading other stories, is that we tend to project our cultural imperialism. We see things through our lens all the time. You see that with the way people are criticizing Palestinians and the way they grieve, right? And the way they're showing bodies, trying to raise awareness. And I think it's really dangerous for us, especially in the West, to do that, to view their grief through our own lens. And that's a really important consideration that gets talked about more than it ever has, I think.
Absolutely. And I think part of that comes from their desperation. And I think part of that comes from they cannot believe this is still going on. You know, at this point, that this amount of people, civilians, children, 10,000 children. I mean, there's a famine in Gaza. I mean, that is, you know, it's 2024. So I think if we just stick to the facts, it's unacceptable. The facts are unacceptable. And I think the reason why people are showing bodies and grieving so openly, and is because they're desperate. And who can, I mean, I understand that desperation.
Yeah. And I think that, this concept of food and how this is, in many, many crises in the world, food is the issue.
Absolutely. I mean, and now we're looking at a famine in Gaza, and I don't know if a famine has been declared in Sudan, but they're saying an extraordinarily high number of people facing malnutrition. I think, and also Afghanistan. I think World Food Program, the work of World Food Program is fundamental. It's so important to all of us.
You've seen Civil War, I'm assuming. I'm sure you've been asked a lot about Civil War.
It was very interesting to see Civil War because I think it was an incredibly powerful movie. I think it was really well done. I love the fact that the protagonists are women and the men are sort of supporting characters, because that never happens with war movies. It's always like a man and the lead. Yeah. So I was really psyched to see that.
And the different ages too. I thought the different ages was really important too. Yeah. You can get both experiences.
Totally. Right. That's right. And it's funny because I recognize myself in both women. Mm-hmm. I really I identified a lot with the young woman. I mean, I still think of myself as that 25-year-old, you're trying to figure out how to shoot a war and all that. And I think it was beautiful to have that. And I also recognize myself in the lead character. There are certain things that, of course, for me, it's my life. And so that movie's not my life, but that's what I do for a living. And so, of course, I'm going to pick apart little things that a normal person or a person who doesn't really know this world wouldn't pick up on. But for me, I guess the sort of the thing that I felt was really missing was why? Why do they do this work? Yeah. That it felt like a road trip through war. Mm-hmm. And it was beautifully done and amazing and impactful. But it's I think for all the people who say fake news and war correspondents are adrenaline junkies, I mean, it's what everyone always says to me, do you do it for the adrenaline? And I want to smack them. But I think it's I think I just wish that it had answered that question a little more as to the importance of getting the images out there, because no one ever filed. There were never any pictures appearing anywhere.
Right.
So you never see the impact of the work.
Yeah.
So that was a bit of an issue.
For sure. I didn't mind the fact that they didn't pick a side, because I didn't need the filmmaker. I'm an adult. I can make up my own decision, right?
Right.
But you're right.
Exactly.
The why is for sure really important. Could you identify at all with, and I don't want to spoil the film, but near the end, when the lead character, when Kiki Dunn's, when there's it's a real transition, the freeze versus the young one who runs. Could you ever identify with that moment of an athlete?
Yes.
Yeah. An athlete has told me in the past.
I write about it in my book. Yeah. I mean, I write about very specifically about being paralyzed by fear in my book. So I was like, oh, that looks familiar. Yeah. But it was because the morning we were kidnapped, the day we were kidnapped in Libya, I had this overwhelming premonition that something was going to happen to us. And in fact, of course, later that day we were kidnapped, but all leading up to that, I kind of I wasn't shooting and I was kind of fumbling, and all I could think about was getting out of there. Yeah. But I was in a car with 3 other journalists and they were not on the same page. I mean, I think the thing about war is that whoever you share a car with, you have to have the same kind of tolerance for fear, and you have to kind of be on the same page of how far forward you want to go and how long you want to stay. Right. And so I did identify with that. I'm not sure I identified with the total meltdown the minute they got in the White House, because anyone like me who's been doing this my whole life, obviously that's what she built up to.
I'm curious, just before you go, what's this thing that you have to not be a normal person to be able to do this? How does that manifest itself in your at-home life?
Oh my God, I'm so domestic at home. I baked a loaf of bread like 2 hours ago. I just read to my son's class again, like 18 5-year-olds. So like, I'm completely like Italian American mother at home. Like I just like, I get up with my husband. Of course, we get the kids out the door and then I have my workouts and whatever. But I'm very much, when I'm home, I'm home. And I love being with my family and friends. And I think that that's maybe perhaps what keeps me grounded is the fact that I come from like, I grew up in an amazing family with 3 older sisters. My parents, everyone was so loving. And now I have a great family. And I think that really helps.
What's your policy on the conversation around when to be involved and when to not be involved in a scenario? You must have experienced this in Darian Gap. Like, and there are some pretty strong camps on either side of this.
So I guess the rule is we can't get involved. Like, you're not supposed to ever get involved. But I mean, like, we're also human beings. We're not robots, right? So I think the important things are this. Like, you can't like buy people. You can't give money to people because obviously then it's like buying access. You don't want to do anything that will endanger you and all the people you're working with. So, for example, there was a pregnant woman on the side of the road in Afghanistan. Her water had broken. Her husband's first wife died in childbirth. I gave them a ride to the hospital. I'm not, maybe some people will like, criticize me and say, you're horrible. How dare you? But she probably could have died on the side of the road. Right. And like, I'm fine with taking that criticism. What I wouldn't do is like give someone in uniform or with a weapon a ride to the hospital if they were wounded, because it's very important to not get involved in a civil war or in a war and take someone, a combatant, in your car.
Right.
In the Darian Gap, I mean, I'll give ibuprofen to someone who's just broken their ankle, because like I have it. And like, okay, someone can criticize me and say like, oh, well, you bought access. I don't really think so. Like most of these cases, I've already taken pictures and like, if I can alleviate someone's pain, I will.
Right. Lynsey, it's really nice to see you again. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Yeah, thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Well, send you my time.
Yeah, please do.
Take care.
Bye-bye. Bye.
All right. Bye.